Welcome to another episode of The Wrong Idea. In case you're unfamiliar, being wrong is about embracing subjective experience over objective truth. We are not interested in being correct, we just want to explore our own insights and opinions. I'm Jack, joined by my brother Lucas, and today we're taking another step into our deep dives with belief systems. I'm going to throw it over to my brother Lucas to give us a little recap of where we've gone so far.
Well, this has been quite the journey up to this point. We've talked a lot about what beliefs are, why they're important, what they allow us to do, and how to identify our own beliefs. So, the exploration thus far has been, I would categorize it as methods to help us figure out what our beliefs are and how they relate to our values and how that gets interpreted in the world as decisions. So, what we do and how we act in the world fundamentally comes back to our beliefs. And identifying those beliefs is the first step in making progress towards changing beliefs, which is where we want to get to today. Is that fair?
I think that's perfect. I like the emphasis here. I want to emphasize it again myself that I think that all of these steps that we've taken in these previous episodes of, how these manifest in the real world, trying to figure out, what your core beliefs are, figuring out what your like belief system might be, how they sort of work together, their relationships is all really important for this because I think for us, we found this is by far the most complex step of the puzzle.
And I think that it should be. Beliefs are important, and it's more importantly, we've talked about how being flexible and open-minded is the key to making progress in life. So if you want to remain open-minded, you're going to need to be willing to change your beliefs and absolutely the dynamics of beliefs. In fact, this is kind of an interesting way to frame it. What we've talked about so far is kind of the statics of beliefs. Statics meaning like they're sort of the beliefs as they are in place in a snapshot of time. The dynamics of beliefs would be how they change. And so absolutely dynamic models tend to be a lot more complicated than these static models. But in order to have any sense of how the dynamics work, we first need to understand the statics, how things are structured so that we can learn how to manipulate them.
Yeah, for sure. And once you have that all figured out and you now know what you have in your static place and you can start to look at your dynamics, I think that first question is sort of naturally what do you want to change about what you believe? And I'll throw it to you because I have my idea, but I want to see how I can play off of what do you think? What do you want to change when you're thinking about changing your beliefs?
So I think that the first place my mind jumps to is that it's not always clear to me that I I want to change one of my beliefs. What usually happens to me is that I will be taking action in the world or I'll have made some decision and I don't like the outcome or I don't like, something doesn't feel right to me and that will force me to question, was I making that decision authentically? And if the answer to that is no, I'll tend to think, okay, maybe I was operating on some beliefs that might need to change.
Right, when your behaviors start to manifest in ways that don't feel true to those beliefs that you have on the inside, you begin to notice trends or maybe you begin to notice an awkward scenario where you feel sort of out of place. You don't really feel like you said like you're acting authentically. You sort of feel out of place. I think those are good signals for when you might need to realize that you need to shift your dynamic. I think maybe change is a little bit of a big word here. There doesn't necessarily need to be a like polarizing shift. Maybe it's like a modification or a tweak, or maybe it's just a difference in a couple of words to try and encompass a little bit more what your belief sees, or maybe you're trying to cut it off a little, whatever it is. But I think in general, it's just sort of figuring out that as life, like you said, is a dynamic thing. What about the dynamics need to change?
You've brought up a couple of interesting points there. The first thing to me is that yes, belief systems, you almost were using sort of that gardening analogy again, which I like a lot. If you think about your belief system as sort of this garden or even a single bush or tree or whatever, yes, there are going to be small modifications you can make, and maybe that's all that's required. And you know, changing those kinds of beliefs will probably not be as difficult as changing, and the term again I'll use is core beliefs. And these are the things again we've talked about that are sort of the base of everything, the base of the belief system, the beliefs that we take as pure truth, something that we take as assumptions. Those are absolutely going to be harder to change, and if they do change, it's sort of like lopping off a whole part of the tree or whatever, right? Or not necessarily lopping it off, but my point is some dramatic change to the system that causes it to be substantially different, and that is more of a fundamental change to who you are.
Yeah, that's such a fun analogy. I love that. Yeah, this idea that you don't want to like chop off a whole branch if you got a couple of dead leaves. Like that's not a good idea. Don't go overboard. Take it in stride with what needs to be done. But what I want to do now is I want to take a little bit of a closer look as to why we want to change them. We've figured out what about them you might want to change, or even so, why you might want to change what you want to change. But like, what do you think are the whys behind why you want to change them? I know we said authenticity. Is there anything else that comes to mind which you think is could be, a little bit more specific or just different from that feeling inauthentic?
So the piece of this that comes to mind is the notion of personal truth. In other words, the the truth, subjective truth, the kind of truth that a person, like what I believe to be true. And there are certainly facts about the world, and you can think of these as beliefs that just happen to be true and could be observed by other people, and we would be able to measure and agree on what those the result of those measurements. So we would know that yes, if I walk outside and I say it's raining, I've done some measurement by having water hit my face from the sky. And I was like, oh, yeah, it's raining. And then you did the same thing and you said, yeah, it's raining. So we agree on that. That's fine. We believe it's raining, certainly. And absolutely, if water is falling on us from the sky, it is raining. So there's that. But what I'm talking about is the personal truth, what we hold to be real, whatever that means to us. So I guess to answer your question, why do we change beliefs? For me, it's like that's what happens when you decide that something is true that wasn't before, or you decide that something, yeah, somehow your personal truth is changing or evolving.
Yeah, I like this a lot. It definitely ties a whole lot into that idea of authenticity, and I think that it's important to be in touch with yourself in order to do this, because when your personal truths start to change, it's a very subconscious practice. It's not a conscious thing at all. And in order to be able to identify when this stuff is happening, you should be pretty well in touch with everything up to this point, which I think puts an emphasis on those front end episodes of, like, you got to know the statics in order to know these dynamics, and to be well in touch with those will give you a better idea of when your personal truths start to change, so you can start to identify the things that are holding you back, or I'm going to use this shameless segue here, or limiting you in what beliefs you hold, right? So a limiting belief, that's a term that you and me came across so frequently in this current section of our observations. And I think we found that limiting beliefs are is like that general term used by people to describe beliefs that should be changed. But I can't remember from last night. You said something, it was a slightly better term to describe a more encompassing term to say beliefs that should be just changed in general. Do you remember what that was?
Not at the moment, but I want to kind of jump back for a minute because I think that we haven't, like, I think you were interpreting my definition of truth there in almost more of a grand sense than I was intending. Like, yes, it can be that extreme, but your personal truth might change in very small ways as well. And this is still what I mean when I say your truth is changing. Like for me, it's an encompassing way to think about all this, but there's more subtle aspects to it. For example, your beliefs might change because you see some new evidence for something that changes your mind. Oh, maybe I what I believed wasn't true. Something that evidence that contradicts what you currently believe. And if you're presented with enough evidence over time, Like every new piece of evidence will update your beliefs. This is sort of the notion of Bayesian statistical probability update to your belief systems. You know, we have some all of our beliefs we hold with some level of confidence, but as new evidence is presented, we need to update our beliefs over time. So this is more of a gradual shift where it's just sort of like my notion of truth. It may not be something that I'm necessarily holding tightly onto. It may just be that it evolves as new evidence is presented. But there are certainly more radical kinds of belief change where suddenly you have a realization of some kind or you have some experience that has such emotional or cognitive impact that it feels transformative. So I think it's important here to talk a little bit about the the importance of both the logical side of belief change and the emotional aspects, in that our beliefs might change for a variety of reasons, and they could be slow, logical, deliberate, or they could be rapid, emotional, and or even social influence as well can have impact. And certainly our own introspection can have impact in how we change our beliefs, right? All of these things come into play.
Yeah, this is true. I'm glad you're emphasizing this. This is a good place to track back to, and I think this definitely highlights a little bit better and in more detail the nuance that I was like, you need to be very well in touch with yourself to know this. Yeah, like you were saying, your beliefs don't have to change. Your truth is what you were saying doesn't have to change in such a drastic way. This is very true. Like you said, it could change in very small ways, and in order to best identify that, you need to be able to look at you know different things which might be changing it, right? So you definitely talked about this difference between how these sort of truths your truth can change. You talked about those big experiences. I like to think of those as like maybe you have one huge oh shit moment where you something just pops into your head and everything goes boom 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 boom, and all of a sudden you've had some emotional gravity which shifts you in one direction, which completely changes your belief on something like completely overnight. I can definitely think of a couple of personal experiences which was just like in the blink of an eye or the snap of a thumb. I was my beliefs on something had completely changed. Maybe just an entirely new subset of information was introduced into my brain, and because of whatever prior experiences or however my logical paths and my brain work, it formed some new beliefs for me. And I think that's sort of that more emotional side. But I want to get your feedback on what you think of that before we dive more into like that sort of like Bayesian, more slow, more methodical approach.
I'm going to come at this from a couple of different angles, but yes, what you're talking about are these, maybe the best way to describe it is a paradigm shift, where literally some assumption that you've made, some deep assumption that you've made. I mean, I guess I would associate these more with core beliefs being disrupted. That tends to be more of those moments where it's like, holy cow, I can't believe, like, I'm thinking about things in a whole new way. That's why I use the term paradigm shift. I'm also really curious to hear the snap of a thumb. I want to hear you snap your thumb. That sounds pretty cool. I also want to touch on a way that started thinking about this that helps me, which is sort of the degree to which we are emotionally attached to our beliefs. Because in some sense, beliefs operate in this causal framework where they're sort of building on each other, and it is sort of a rational, or feels like a rational system, or it's used kind of in this inference framework where we're, you know the consequences of one belief feed into the next belief, and ultimately this leads us to take actions in the world. But at the same time, we have beliefs that are tied very deeply to emotions that we feel very strongly. So we, even though they might actually be somewhat irrational, we might hold on to them and believe them because we are so emotionally attached. So what I the concept that I wanted to get across was this idea that if you could measure, and I mean this is a very simplified model, but if you could measure from like 0 to 100% emotionally attached, if I'm 100% attached, it's going to be very hard for you to dislodge that idea just by using rational logic. You're not going to convince me that I'm wrong about this, because even if it's wrong, like my emotion is so strong that I feel defensive about it or whatever. But then if you sort of slide, as you slide down, maybe you get to around 50%. Now, maybe as soon as I'm, below that 50% threshold, I'm still emotionally attached to it, but because I'm weighted now more rationally than I am emotionally, you have a better chance of convincing me that I'm wrong by using logical reasoning, or not even you convincing me, but just me being convinced by new evidence that I experience in the world. So if you were to bring that all the way down to zero, it's like, yeah, then all you need to do is show me like evidence that I'm wrong. And because I have very little emotional stake in it, I'm not going to put up much of a fight. It's like, it doesn't take much to convince me.
I think this is sort of an interesting thing because I my brain is sort of naturally tying this into the more Bayesian approach. Actually, interestingly enough, because you talked about this like slider scale. If you're at you know to say 95%, it's gonna take a lot to try and get you to change your belief. And to me, it almost feels like if you have those beliefs that you have such a strong emotional tie to, you need more of this like maybe a like the Bayesian approach, right? Literally, this constant stream of new evidence coming towards you, which starts to lower and lower and lower your emotional connection to these beliefs, which eventually gets you into a place where you might just having a like an emotional event or a reaction which shifts your view on something, whereas those ones which are weighted a little lower don't need so much evidence. If it's 10 or 15%, maybe just one foul swoop of something coming at you will just swipe you off your feet and change your beliefs. But those ones which are a little higher up on the bar to me seem like they would need a little bit more evidence, not just to get your belief down but to remove your emotional connection. I think is really what that evidence will do, because I think a lot of the reason why we cling on to beliefs in the first place is just because we hold an emotional connection to them. And I think you can even hold an emotional connection to them if it's a very logical belief. Because I think just even so, if you value logical beliefs, then you have that emotional connection to the logic, hence you have the emotional connection to the belief. So either way, I think that the ability to have evidence coming at you when you hold very strongly onto a belief, or even when you hold weakly onto a belief, maybe there should be something which is empowering that belief up. Don't just necessarily take it as things which can detract from your belief. Maybe you need to strengthen them for whatever reason. Changing doesn't necessarily need to be shifting them in a negative direction. Maybe it's you're going more towards the belief of the belief of the belief, right? What's your opinion on how I think I've sort of abstracted the way these two play together?
This is super interesting to me for a number of reasons. Let me see if I can keep all this straight. The first thing I'm thinking of was I was actually making the opposite argument, but now what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me as well. I guess my point was that when you're emotionally attached, no matter how much evidence you're presented with, it may not even matter because you may be blinded by that emotion. But I do think that you make a good point where it's like maybe if enough information or enough examples get presented to you, it may sort of wear you down a little bit. So I think that there's something to be said there. Then you said that it's not that all emotions that are you have a strong emotional attachment to are irrational. I certainly didn't mean to imply that because I agree with you completely. Like you could be very emotionally attached to a very rational idea or very unemotionally attached to a very irrational idea. Like it wouldn't matter. I guess it's a question of how hard it is to change those things. And all I was trying to get at is that the more emotionally involved or attached you are, the harder it will be to dislodge that. But I think to your point, then also this last piece is super interesting. This notion that we might need to strengthen our emotional ties to certain beliefs, where I actually find this to be the case with like the way that I go about curating my own belief system is that if I have a belief, I want to know why I have that belief and I want to be confident that that's a good belief for me to hold. So I will often go looking for evidence to either contradict or confirm what my beliefs are. And I'll do that if I have a belief and I know that I don't have a lot of good evidence for it. It's like, yeah, it is important to me that I know what I'm talking about or that I can speak with some level of confidence about the beliefs I hold. Because sometimes people will absolutely hold those beliefs where it's just like they heard someone say something once and they don't know any better. So they just adopt that belief as their own, but they've done no work to actually understand why that belief should matter to them.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking this as like a you should hold your beliefs with as much certainty as either evidence or experience that you have to back it up. That's not to necessarily say that the ones that you have an emotional connection to or an irrational, whatever, however we framed this, aren't ones that you should believe. But I think that strong and good beliefs that stand to really help you and benefit you the most can have evidence behind them backing them up. I think those ones which you're really strongly emotionally attached to, at some point or another, I'm almost certain that you could put a connection of just straight raw evidence, right? Regardless of how irrational or rational it may be. There I think that a piece of evidence can totally be correlated to that. But I remember we talked about this previously. You should be as confident in your beliefs, and yeah, it was as you should be as confident in your beliefs as you should, as like a direct relationship to how much evidence you can have to present to back it up. And I think this is also an important thing that I want to talk about because the ability to be, you know, super rigid with your beliefs, I think could literally just be limiting you from changing your limiting beliefs, which is something that I do want to talk about a little bit here in a moment. But I think that the ability to realize that certain beliefs that you have can be weak, it could be a good sign for you to want to change it. If you have a weak belief or a weak set of beliefs that you notice are coming up quite often in certain situations, it's a good time to, maybe take a little bit of a closer look at them, refine them a little bit better. Because if it's going to be more and more pertinent, then you're going to want to have a good belief to sit on and to settle on. But that also doesn't mean that you want to just settle on the ones that you have in place. You should, of course, be critical of them, be willing to the fact that you can, be wrong about the beliefs that you have, and that the ability to change them and modify them is only part of the natural process of how they exist, right?
So I want to say a couple of things here. I maybe want to modify or explore further something that you were saying, because I think it was like how much evidence you have, and I think you might have been using that in the same way that I'm thinking about, but I think it may not be obvious. I guess what I'm saying is this: I don't necessarily need a lot of evidence to be highly confident in my beliefs. In other words, if I touched a stove once and it was hot and I burned myself and it made me unhappy, chances are the belief that I should not touch hot things is, I have good evidence for that. It only happened once, but I'm going to hold on to that. Like, it would take a lot to convince me that that belief is worth changing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. This is a good distinction, actually. I maybe misspoke a little bit. Yeah, it's how much good evidence you have, right? I think that's an important distinction because that's a perfect example. But yeah, I assume that I'm thinking about it. How are you thinking about it? I want to make sure that we're on the same page here because this is a good thing to touch on.
Well, it's just, how much, it's not even, again, like how much, like the quality of the evidence. It's like there's an emotional impact that that experience would have on me. Like, if your friend decides to blindly walk into the street and gets hit by a bus, like chances are you're going to believe that looking both ways before you cross the street is a good idea. And again, like that's an even more extreme version of this same thing where it's like it's okay to have these strong emotional ties to beliefs and only a small amount of evidence for them if you have reason to believe that those will be effective in operating within the world. The problem is when you have that same level of emotional attachment to a belief, and again it might have only been one traumatic incident that set it off, but then that belief becomes problematic for you, and this gets to where you want to go with limiting beliefs, because it's sort of a question of any belief that is preventing you from getting where you want to go or doing something you want to do. And it's those beliefs when you need to start questioning, like, what is my emotional attachment to this belief, and is it worth considering that I might be wrong about it?
Yeah, this is a good thing to touch on. The validation of emotional evidence. Yes. I think that maybe that I was under the impression subconsciously or whatever that emotional evidence is something bad to have, or maybe that's for whatever, that's what I was thinking in a moment. But yeah, no, emotional evidence is important to have. It's good to have as a support, but the the ability to recognize that, maybe the one time thing was a bit of an off chance experience. Like, I can give you an example for myself. If you go back, holy, it was probably almost 5 summers ago now. It's been a minute. I barrel rolled my cousin Sam's quad bike, and for a long time, I just was very uncomfortable with being anything off center balance because that sensation of, you know, tipping that thing over and having it get snagged on a rock was incredibly, incredibly traumatic. It's a horrifying feeling. I basically couldn't ride a bike for 6 months, and it took me almost eight to get back to any sort of form of a race car or cart. Like I just had trouble sitting in SUV cars for a moment in time. But then again, I also couldn't stress enough the amount of times that I had done more ridiculous things and ended up perfectly fine. So that limiting belief got in my way for a long, long, long time, and I had a deep emotional attachment to it. But eventually, over time, I started to realize that this was holding me back. It was stopping me from achieving my dream, which at the time and still is to, you know, be a great racing driver. So as I got back into racing karts and being in cars that were, you know, going quickly again, and, you know, getting comfortable with getting a little bit more off my balance on a bike, I started to realize that the belief that I had, that limiting belief that was holding me back for so long, was slowly starting to melt away as I got more evidence for it.
See, that's a really good example of what we're talking about here, because that's a an experience that can have a strong emotional impact and can lead you to believe something that prevents you from making progress. I like that you're coming to this point where you're saying that because you were open to those to new evidence, that you were able to let that belief fade away over time. So you actually, you recognize that there was a belief that was starting to hold you back, and then you said, okay, like, how am I going to change this belief? And you, it turns out, used this approach of, yes, I am emotionally attached to this, so maybe the way to become less attached to it is to, try to put that belief to the test. And when you put it to the test multiple times and found that it wasn't necessarily true, you made it a lot easier to dislodge and change that belief and, make real progress again.
And I think that even so, it better informed other beliefs of mine. It certainly proved that it wasn't true in all scenarios, but it also made me cautious in other scenarios, which could have gotten me into trouble. Like, you know, maybe previously, if I would have, you know, gotten into a sticky situation, because I've still ridden quad bikes since then. I actually took them through, God, it was probably almost 50, 60 miles of desert. It was a wild experience down on the border of Mexico. And I definitely got into a couple of situations where if I wouldn't have had that experience, I probably would have tipped that thing over because I wouldn't have known where, like, that sense of, oh, I'm gonna eat shit here is gonna be. So it definitely helped inform other beliefs which I had about the same thing. But also, like you said, I was very open to new evidence because I had a good reason to be. But the ability for me to be open to seeing the new evidence and having it change while also being conscious and keeping in mind the lesson that I had learned definitely strengthened overall the beliefs that I had surrounding that area. They made them more informed, it made them more usable, and it definitely made them more applicable.
So there's something about overgeneralization. In other words, when we take one experience, we develop a belief from that experience, and then that informs our other beliefs, but in a bad way. So what you were just talking about is great, where it's like you were able to take that experience and extrapolate from it and figure out how it can apply in other situations, and that's a good version of one belief informing other areas of your life. But it can be dangerous when you run into a situation where you develop one belief and it's so powerful that you may think that it has application outside of that one specific context. So, I mean, again, I keep like wanting to go to these really extremes of beliefs you might hold, but it's like daddy went out to 7-Eleven and it's been 8 years and he hasn't come back. Like, so now, like, when someone, like, I'm always, I believe that people will leave me, or I believe that I can't get close to people or something. And like, you now generalize that to all of these situations where you're actually making it harder for yourself to develop actually healthy relationships because you're afraid of what would happen if you lose those things. So it can be a situation, I guess, where I'm saying, like, this is when, again, when you start to know that it's worth looking at, is this belief causing me harm or preventing me from getting where I want to be? Because there can be these things that are so powerful that they can bleed into other areas of your life. And I guess that's a good way to figure out, like, am I overgeneralizing? Am I trying to apply this belief in places where it doesn't belong?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a pretty good place to round this off before we sink our teeth into next week's journey. Is there anything else that you want to touch on, maybe that I've said, or just another concept that you want to go into real quick before we close this out?
No, I think that we've done a good job of thinking through the whys of belief change. If we're thinking about now the dynamics of the model, like, where is this coming from? Why might we be wanting to change our beliefs? Is it that we have conflicting beliefs, limiting beliefs? How are we identifying beliefs that we want to change and understanding what our motivation for changing those would be, and then sort of talking through a little bit of the strategies that go, or the mechanisms by with which beliefs change, like gradually or all at once, and how can we start to influence those, I guess, is the next question for me. And that's why I think it will be beneficial for us to think through a little bit more of a model or some sort of framework to at least help us dive into what we can do, actionable steps we can take to change our beliefs, because we've understood what that kind of means now, what it would even require for us to be able to do that belief change. So the question now becomes, how do we put that into practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this conversation was incredibly beneficial for myself in terms of setting myself up to get ready for this. And I think that the next time that we have before we get into really formalizing a good system for this is going to be a whole lot of fun.
Sounds good.
Alrighty. If you guys enjoyed this episode, make sure to check us out at The Wrong Idea on Instagram, TikTok, and X. And until next time, keep being wrong.
Got a thought that challenges the norm? We want to hear it. Post your wrong idea with the hashtag wrong idea. That's RONG idea. And join the conversation. Who knows? Your perspective might just be featured in a future episode. Remember, in a world of endless perspectives, all ideas are wrong ideas. Until next time, keep thinking, keep challenging, and keep embracing the unconventional.